find yourself morbidly fascinated by the worst kinds of tragedy, then you've come to the right place. When a crime happens and an investigation begins, obviously the major goal is to figure out who was behind it and why. But not a lot of people realize that once an investigation is started, their family's entire life is going to be put under a microscope and examined. That's exactly what happened to Allie Southern when he came home one day to find his wife collapsed on the lawn. She claimed an intruder in their home had fired at her, and she'd been hit in her lower right side. The operator asked the man if he knew who'd wounded her, and the husband screamed back that he had no clue. He said Judy mumbled something about a person named Barry, but that he didn't know any Barrys. Investigators didn't know it yet, but they were going to uncover a motive for this crime that was so senseless and disgusting that it would continue to haunt them for the rest of their lives. So what exactly happened? Judy Southern was returning home from a long day of work to what she thought was an empty house, but she was wrong. Inside, she was ambushed by an unknown trigger man and was hit in the right side as she scrambled out of the house and collapsed on the lawn. Holding her wound, she used her cell phone to call her husband's work, but he had already left for the day and was still driving home. By the time Allie Southern got there a few minutes later, he could hear Judy calling his name and rushed to her aid. In disbelief, he asked what happened, and she told him there was an intruder in their home with a firearm and she'd been hit. Allie could see she was in bad shape and carried her to the car while dialing 911. Unfortunately, by the time the Southerns got to the hospital, there was little the doctors could do for Judy. Judy passed before her twin sister could say goodbye, and the entire family was completely devastated by the loss. It was clear how much she was loved and how much of a shock the news came to their family. The investigators wanted to know if Judy had any enemies or was involved with any dangerous individuals or dealings, and the family assured them definitely not. They turned to the crime scene to examine any evidence that the intruder might have left behind, and they thankfully found a whole trail of breadcrumbs. Yeah, he Hansel and Gretel'd that bit. Despite Allie claiming an unknown intruder had attacked his wife, there was no evidence of forced entry in the house. Interesting. The crime scene also showed that the person had gone into the home with the intention to commit violence. The phone lines were found cut, and all the knives in the home had been hidden. This person had also spent quite a bit of time in the house, like in every single room of the house, and DNA revealed he'd even taken a shower, played a kid's video game, and used an adult toy on himself while he waited in the empty home. You can decide for yourselves in what order, because that question has never been answered. Cigarette butts scattered throughout the house were collected for evidence, along with the shell casings from a 9mm that were found in the hallway. And most incriminating of all, a handwritten note was discovered lying next to Judy's body in the yard. In scraggly writing, it read, "This is for my wife, Melanie. I love you. Sorry it had to end like this. I leave everything that I have to my loving, caring wife." The note was signed by someone named Jonathan, but the last name was hard to read. They thought it looked like Binny or Barry, but they couldn't tell. Props to the investigators for deciphering that one. On the 911 call, Allie said Judy mumbled her attacker might have been someone named Barry, and that intrigued the investigators. But what did this bizarre note have to do with the crime? Did someone place the note there as a distraction to keep the cops from looking into them? Despite the fact that it seemed someone had literally signed their signature next to the crime, the note actually complicated things more. Because with the note, it sounded like some random guy they didn't know was threatening to take his own life. And what the heck did that have to do with Judy Southern's slaying? Cryptic notes aside, the authorities had already discovered that Allie Southern had a potential motive for wanting Judy gone. The authorities, like in most of these cases, were zeroing in on the husband as a suspect first, but Allie swore up and down that he had nothing to do with it. Judy's twin sister, Trudy, said that Judy and Allie had had marriage troubles for years, that they were both having affairs and slept in separate bedrooms of the house. She claimed the couple had only stayed together for the sake of their 5-year-old son, agreeing that divorce would be too hard on him. Oof, that's rough. Others claim Judy told them that if something were ever to happen to her, that Alan most likely had something to do with it. And then something shocking was found at the crime scene, a recording device hidden in the Southern's home phone. Trudy said that her sister believed Alan might have been secretly recording her phone calls, so they decided to test it out. The twins started fabricating stories to see if any would make their way back to them. And when Alan subtly brought up something regarding one of the lies, they knew they had been right. Ooh, Alan, it is not looking good for you. Detectives confirmed that at the time of the break-in, Alan had 2 previous affairs under his belt, and Judy was currently in one. Trudy had also said that 2 days before she was attacked, Judy confided that she and Alan were officially separating. Judy was allegedly afraid for her life, saying things had become increasingly hostile and the two had gotten into a huge fight. And now that was a motive the authorities could work with. If Judy was gone, Alan would gain sole custody of their son, as well as Judy's hefty life insurance policy. But some things still weren't adding up. Alan had no history of violence. He didn't own a 9mm, and he'd passed a polygraph test. Besides, his alibi of being at work and driving home at the exact time of the crime had checked out, so the investigators came up with a new theory. If Alan was the one who planned the crime, maybe he'd hired someone to do the actual dirty work for him. So the investigators turned back to that oh-so-perplexing note. They'd originally believed the signature at the bottom said Jonathan Barry, since Judy had been able to mention something about the name Barry when Alan had found her. The note had been written to my wife Melanie, and at the top, in small writing, it had a mailing address under the name Melanie Binney. And they were like, alright, let's see if we can find some Binneys. They looked through marriage records until they found Melanie Binney, who had a 26-year-old husband by the name of Jonathan. They also discovered that the Binneys lived only 3 miles down the road from the Southerns. This was convenient, aside from the fact that Alan said he'd never met the Binneys and didn't know a Jonathan or a Melanie. And the authorities were like, sure you don't. But they knew this had to have been a slaughter for hire, because Alan definitely seemed to have a motive for wanting Judy gone. But Jonathan, they never even met. Determined to prove Alan was lying, the detectives got to work, looking through phone records and emails to see if the two men had ever been in contact with each other. With no messages between the two, they checked every public record, system, and database available until exhausting their resources. They could not find a single shred of evidence that the two men had ever potentially spoken or crossed paths with each other. It was finally time to consider that Alan could be telling the truth, and that a less logical motive could be the reason for this bizarre crime. It was now Jonathan's turn for his life to be put under the microscope. But when they ran a background check on Jonathan Binney, what they found was so beyond horrifying that they realized maybe Alan had been telling the truth all along. I need to preface this and just say it's very bad. Like, I don't even want to say it out loud bad. So you can imagine for yourself what type of crime I'm getting at here. You know, the other worst possible thing you can do to another human being. They discovered that Jonathan was out on bond after previously being arrested for his 3-month-old daughter. Yeah. It's really the worst thing ever, and I'm sorry I even had to hint at it. In the note they'd found, the writer mentioned taking his own life because the thought of going to prison for what he did to his own child was too much for him. Oh, boo fucking who. But with this new piece of information, suddenly the note was beginning to make sense. Well, sort of. They still couldn't understand exactly why Judy and Jonathan's previous crime were connected, but they knew if they could prove that Jonathan was the author of this note, more pieces would fall into place. To confirm that Jonathan had written the note, they sent it to a document analysis expert, along with a sample of Jonathan Binney's real handwriting. With his open lowercase g's and f's that tilted away from the rest of his words, the expert could prove with absolute certainty that the writing was identical. That, and the fingerprints on the note belonged to Jonathan as well. But when authorities rolled up to the Binneys' home, Jonathan was nowhere to be found. An all-out manhunt was a go as searchers and canine units stomped through the woods on a quest for Binney, while helicopters used thermal imaging from the sky. The next morning, authorities went back to Binney's house to see if he'd returned. They were in luck and found him lying shirtless in a sleeping bag in his basement with 4 nick patches on his chest. He told them he was attempting to OD with the patches, and the cops were like, yeah, For sure, dude. That's totally how it works. And dragged him out of the basement. As they led him up the stairs in handcuffs, he mumbled something under his breath that one of the officers heard. Jonathan asked quietly, "She's dead, isn't she?" And the officer was like, "Who?" Jonathan responded, "The woman I shot." But of course, once they got him in the interrogation room and started to get real, he recanted his confession and asked for an attorney. And they were like, damn it. So they booked him in a cell while continuing to build their case against him. The cigarette butts collected at the scene were confirmed to be a match for Jonathan's DNA, and the discarded 9mm pistol was finally found in a field between the Binney's home and the Southerns. A firearm examiner compared the shell casings from the crime scene with the weapon and had no doubt that this was the incriminating weapon. And then, just to make extra sure the weapon was Binney's, they searched his bedroom and were able to find a pair of jeans with a 9mm unspent Makarov in the pocket. Ooh, that could have broken the washing machine. They also found a holster, magazine holders, and a security badge that all suggested Jonathan possessed a firearm. With all the evidence pointing to Binney, they needed to figure out what the motive was. If Alan hadn't hired Binney to assassinate his wife, then what did Jonathan have on Judy that he would need her gone? They looked for every possible, conceivable, and inconceivable explanation for how Judy and Jonathan could have been linked. Did she at one point use the bank that he was briefly a security guard at? Did they shop at the same grocery stores? Was she along her mail carrier route? Literally, the only thing they could find that the two seemed to have in common was that they both had a public library card to the same library. Oh, and you know that's where all the bad guys go to hang out. As they scratched their heads over a motive for Jonathan, they got a call from the devil himself, who, after sitting a few nights in the county jail, had decided he was ready to talk and requested to not have an attorney present. And they were like, no problem with that. See you in a bit. The detectives were relieved and rolled up expecting Jonathan to come clean about Alan hiring him to be his trigger man. Instead, what Jonathan Binney confessed to the investigators became one of the strangest, most standout confessions they had ever heard. First off, right away, when they got there, he told them he wanted capital punishment, and that was what he deserved for his crimes. Next, he told them in words, and later in a 5-page confession letter, exactly what he did that day and why. Remember that unspeakable crime against his daughter that he'd been arrested for? Turns out, it actually was connected to Judy slaying. Well, sort of. And his first arrest had become the motive for why he decided to end the life of Judy Southern. Despite being out on bond at the moment, Jonathan's attorney had warned him that if he was found guilty of the crime against his daughter, he would most likely spend a minimum of 10 years in prison. Well, that was just unacceptable to Jonathan. He explained that he knew that guys like him wouldn't be treated well in prison, and if he was gonna go to prison, he was gonna go with a bang, literally. You don't have to be a hardened criminal to know that there's definitely a hierarchy with where inmates rank in relation to their crimes. And even amongst the worst offenders, it's an unspoken rule that child predators are the lowest of the low. And see, Jonathan knew that people like him didn't fare well in prison, so he decided he wasn't gonna go as a child M-word. He was gonna go as a different M-word. He confirmed for them that he didn't know the Southerns and that Alan had nothing to do with the crime. He said he'd chosen the Southerns' house at random while he was driving around on his moped and entered the house through an unlocked window. He snooped around the house, cut the phone lines, and waited for whoever would be the first person to arrive home. While waiting, he made himself lunch, went through the family's personal stuff, and took a shower. They believed that Judy had come home around 3:30 and Jonathan didn't hear her. She didn't realize anything was wrong until she walked into the kitchen and found the strange note Jonathan had written to his wife lying on the counter. The two surprised each other when Jonathan came out of the bathroom, and Judy grabbed the note and made a break for it. But Jonathan fired 2 rounds at her. The first missed, but the second struck her in the abdomen. As Judy collapsed on the lawn, Jonathan hopped on his moped and tore off through the fields, leaving Alan to find Judy only a few minutes later. Since she'd read the note Jonathan left, she was able to give the name Barry to her husband in one of her final acts. weeks. As far as detectives were concerned, if Judy, Alan, and their 5-year-old son had all arrived home at the same time, they all might have lost their lives that day. Jonathan Binney was sentenced for the crimes against Judy Southern, as well as his 3-month-old daughter, and was sentenced to lethal injection. It was a completely senseless and tragic crime that almost turned an innocent victim into a convicted criminal as well, had it not been for the DNA evidence and Jonathan's confession. And that is easily one of the most senseless and disgusting reasons I think a victim has ever lost their life, or at least as far as the cases we've covered on this show goes. Let's wrap up this story the best way we know how, with little tiny wrap-ups. Aw, so cute.